Welcome to the Learning Can't Wait podcast, an iTutor production. At iTutor, our vision is to ensure every child has access to education, regardless of circumstance. Each episode, we will be joined by pathfinders within and around the education space who are bringing about transformational change on behalf of deserving students. I am your host, Haley Spirabauer. Welcome back, everybody. I am so excited you're joining us today. Our special guest, our podcast guest, is Claire Blumenson, the Executive Director and co-founder of School Justice Project. Claire, welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
I am so excited to have you on the podcast today for a variety of reasons. One of which is, as with many of the guests that have been in the early days of this podcast, you and I know each other personally from our days in the classroom.
Yeah, it feels like it was just yesterday.
It does. And I think that what is particularly interesting about many of the folks that I keep in touch with today, and I think you're no exception to this, we were really touched by our experiences of being teachers and in the classroom, and whether our career has kept us in brick and mortar schools or not, we are doing work that impacts the lives of children everywhere.
Absolutely.
So without spoiling your own introduction, the work you are doing is something I followed for a very long time and something I'm extremely excited for you to tell others about today. So why don't you just dive right in and tell everybody about your journey in education and what you've built at School Justice Project.
Absolutely. So as you said, I'm currently the executive director and co-founder of an organization called School Justice Project. And we're special education lawyers who work with young people in the juvenile and criminal system to make sure that they have access to special education, both during incarceration and throughout the reentry process. And my path to School Justice Project, it was actually relatively straightforward now that I'm looking back, but I certainly didn't think, 10 years ago or whatever, that I would be starting a nonprofit. So I got interested in education at an early age. I was always interested in tutoring and what life in the classroom could look like. But I was also extremely interested in the law as a tool and an equalizer. Both my parents were public defenders. And so I sort of had these dual, not necessarily opposing interests, but just sort of parallel interests in education and in sort of law and public defense. And so in college, I spent a lot of time looking at how education, sort of the disparities in education, and also how education could be used and improved in the country. And so after college, I did Teach for America, where I met you. And I absolutely love teaching. I taught at an all-boys charter school in Brooklyn, and it was an incredible experience. I loved my students. I loved my school. But I will say that, it was during the time of where zero tolerance policies were at, the height. And so students all over the country were getting suspended or expelled for things like, bringing a chain wallet to school and that kind of thing. And so as much as I loved teaching and as much of a difference as I felt, the teachers in the classroom were making, I also kept going back to this idea that maybe the career for me was to focus on education, but potentially through sort of a legal services then. So I ended up going to law school, really focusing on the intersection between education and the justice system. So, as many classes as I could take on things like education and the law, education policy, juvenile justice classes, children in the law. And I tried to sort of figure out what a career in this space would look like. And, it wasn't quite clear to me because I think there just weren't a lot of options out there. But my second year summer in law school, I had a summer internship at the DC Public Defender Service. And there I was able to spend the summer working with the Public Defender Service, but inside a juvenile facility in DC. And during that time, I was, pretty shocked by what I saw. So many of the young people who were in that facility were actually ages 17, 18, 19, and 20. So these were the oldest students. And I had taught third and fourth grade. So, I had no experience working with older students, but I also knew that these young people still had a right to special education through the age of 21, and in DC through the semester in which they turned 22. So here were these young people who still had a right to education, who were in the juvenile system, but also could simultaneously be involved in other systems like the criminal system. So it was sort of there are so many cooks in the kitchen, so many agencies that they potentially could be committed to. And there were just like absolutely no services specifically dedicated to these older students with disabilities. And when I talk about older students with disabilities, I mean, inside the juvenile justice facility, over 80% of the students had special education needs. And that's compared to like 15 to 20% in the community. So 80% inside facilities and then 15 to 20 in the community. So that's just an appalling difference. So, I really was struck by just the disproportionality that I was seeing there. And when we talk about disproportionality, there's both the element of disability, but also race. 100% of the young people who were incarcerated were students of color, basically 97% Black, 3% Latinx. And so, this wasn't a coincidence, right? We know that we have a system that's been built on racism and continues to perpetuate it. So I felt like there was really something there. And when I looked for what services were sort of available for older court-involved students with disabilities, there just wasn't much out there. There were not organizations that were specifically dedicated to this oldest population of students. And most special education lawyers actually are either private, they are paid like $500 an hour or something to work with families who can afford them. And they also generally work with parents of students because your special education rights inure to you when you turn 18. So anyway, this was just sort of a completely unrepresented population in the field. And so I did an Equal Justice Works fellowship that with the Public Defender Service, where I was able to provide special education legal services to young people who were committed to DC's Juvenile Justice Agency and placed inside that same secure facility. And so from that, during those 2 years, I learned a whole lot and saw how many systemic barriers there were. And so I met my co-founder, Sarah, who was also doing a postgraduate fellowship. And the two of us applied for an Echo and Green Black Male Achievement Fellowship in 2013 to get seed funding to start School Justice Project, which, does the same thing that fellowship had done. We provide special education legal services to older court-involved students with disabilities in DC. So that's a lot. But that is sort of how I ended up at School Justice Project. And I can tell you a little bit more about what we do shortly.
Yeah. So that is quite the origin story. And Claire, you said it yourself, but when you look back, it is so obvious to you now what your path was and how linear it is. And I think that's what makes some people so successful at being impactful. They feel called to a particular cause and a particular effort, and they really champion that effort in a variety of ways and continue to build upon their knowledge and experiences. So it's really wonderful to hear just what led you to this, and also alarming to hear some of the highlights of your experiences and learnings during your time that led up to the founding of School Justice Project. So, Claire, I'm wondering, was your co-founder an educator as well, or?
She was not. She was very much in the sort of public defense and actually more interested in the adult population. When on my first day when I met her, she's like, and yeah, I know you were a teacher, but I just want to let you know, like, I'm not a kid person. I really don't like kids. I know I'm working in the juvenile justice setting, but I see myself more in the adult setting. And which is funny because, 10 years later, Sarah and I are still working hard at it, doing, the same work we were doing back then. But she was really passionate about sort of prisoners' rights and reform and being able to make sure that young people or, anyone who's incarcerated, that their rights are able to be enforced, and also, working hard to get them out of facilities. So our work, really, we see it both as increasing educational equity on the education side, but also decreasing the use of mass incarceration. So we use our education arguments to try to get young people out of jail and prison. And we believe, fundamentally that young people are better educated in the community and that they belong in the community. So anyway, Sarah was coming at it from much more of the justice lens, and I was coming at it from more of the education lens. And so together, I think we've been able to really sort of blend those together well.
Well, and it's right in the name, School Justice.
Exactly.
I mean, it makes a lot of sense. So let's start there then. What are the challenges that students with disabilities that are incarcerated or within the system face that are some of these barriers that you're naming? What makes it so much more difficult and challenging?
Yeah, great question. And I could probably like talk about this for at least the next 7 hours. So, I mean, there's some key barriers that we saw, right from the beginning. So first of all, getting education inside secure facilities is just difficult. Often young people are coming to facilities not having had great experiences with education. As I said, that like 80 to 90% of young people who are incarcerated have special education needs. So they already had special education needs while they were in the community schools, and often those needs went unmet. And so when students end up in the justice system, they've already had some experience with educational failure, often, whether it's like suspensions, expulsions, or just not having their needs met and feeling frustrated and sort of disenchanted with school. And then once inside, it's so rare that you actually are getting a good quality education. Like, rights and what you're entitled to aside, just like the actual quality of the education that you're getting is often abysmal. Students will get things like work packets. Math is just math. Like whereas, in the community, there's algebra and geometry and different types of math. But often, in secure facilities, you're just like going to math class and whatever that means. And students are getting packets. They're not necessarily getting the services that they need. So, and all of this is even pre-COVID. So we'll get into sort of what's happened with COVID and how that's just had devastating effects on students. But even pre-COVID, just education inside facilities is often inferior. So that's a key thing that we've worked on. And sometimes this is also related. It's really hard for students' records to transfer back and forth. And so students will get to facilities and they've already taken, these classes, but they're placed back in them again. And so this can lead to what we always call the credits issue, which is sort of the second primary focus. So education inside facilities is being bad. That's one thing. And then the second primary thing is the credits issue. So the credits issue for me, like this was one of the biggest reasons why we had to start School Justice Project. And I feel like I've gotten so many gray hairs over the course of the past 10 years trying to deal with the credits issue. And it's still, it's just, this monster has so many heads. It's like you cut one off and like 1,000 more grow or whatever. So one issue is that students in facilities, they're sent all over the country. So DC students are sent all over the country into different juvenile facilities to be, quote, rehabilitated. And so they're sent there by the DC government. And yet they'll come home and find out that English 1 in Iowa, which they took after being placed there by the DC government, isn't going to count for English 1 in DC. And so, I mean, it's so totally outrageous that students have to go through this. But they'll find that, they've spent years getting A's and B's inside secure facilities all over the country. And then they come home and instead of being a senior in high school, they're still a freshman. They have to start all over again because the credits that they took didn't count. And the schoolwork has completed.
Devastating.
I know. It's like, and I just, it's so frustrating and outrageous to me. And it's not even my life that's, directly affected by this. So you can imagine for young people, how much of a setup this all feels like. And so the credits issue, I mean, another sort of key part of it is sometimes students will get moved from placement to placement over and over. And so they're sort of at placements for too short of a period of time for their credits to count and be accumulated. Yeah. And so being able to like transfer and accumulate credits so that you can work towards a diploma is a really big problem. And luckily, we've been working on both a legislative solution for that. And then, I think over the years, we've sort of developed some tactics to help our individual clients. But this is really a systemic issue. And so no matter how much we're able to like address this for the individual clients we serve, there will continue to be young people coming after them who will experience the same thing. So we need to really fix the system here. So yeah, the credits issue and then education during incarceration are two of the largest issues facing court-involved students with disabilities.
For the educators that are listening, who may be less familiar with what this looks like for an incarcerated student, they're probably picturing, well, when I have a student with disabilities in my school or my classroom, there's someone who's advocating on their behalf, their documentation, their IEP, their 504, making sure that goals are set, they're working towards those goals. What does that process look like when a student is not in a school, but is in fact incarcerated? Is there still the documentation kind of process renewal? Does it look the same? Or is it drastically different as well?
Well, it really should look exactly the same. And, I think the level, the quality of the school inside the facilities is an important, obviously a critically important factor. I mean, there's still special education coordinators inside schools. There's still inside facilities. There's still special education teachers inside facilities. And the rights that special education students have in the community are the same inside facilities. And that holds true, again, for the 18, 19, 20, 21-year-olds. So yeah, so it really should be the same. It's just that that's often not how it plays out.
So in theory, this is a continuation of the type of structures and supports that would help implement an IEP or 504. However, due to some of the issues you named earlier, that isn't the reality.
Exactly.
Which obviously exacerbates, in addition to the curriculum that you're naming as not being as rich and fruitful and maybe engaging, it is also problematic for a student with disability to not have the interventions and supports. What about related service providers? Are related service providers still present in these facilities as well?
Yep. I mean, students should really be getting the exact same thing that they're getting in the community. Related services, specialized instruction, all of it should really just be the same once they're inside a facility. Often that's, again, just not the case. I think another sort of barrier to, even if the school is good inside the facility, it can also be really hard for the school to operate within sort of a Department of Corrections setting. So, in order to teach students, there need to be like corrections officers or, youth development officers who are moving the students to the classroom from their cells. And so if the students don't get to the classroom because all movement's been stopped or something like that, it's really hard for the teachers to teach. But again, that can be frustrating, right? Because you have different agencies that are all sort of tied together trying to, make sure that the students can get what they need or sort of hindering that. But ultimately, like for whatever reason, whether it's the sort of court agency or prison agency, or if it's the school or education system, the bottom line is that the child isn't getting what he needs.
Well, you wouldn't exist if they were, right? Like School Justice Project clearly wouldn't have been built if the system was working as it should. So
if things could organically, work themselves out, I would love to be out of a job. But unfortunately, it's sort of like the more we got in there and started realizing what the problems were, the worse, like the more we saw how just like pervasive and systemic everything was, and that it, there were not things that could be worked out, student by student, that like there needs to be some serious system overhauls.
So the big elephant in the room that you alluded to earlier is COVID.
Yes.
How has COVID altered, for better or for worse, the education of students with disabilities in the system?
I mean, COVID has been a total disaster. I mean, obviously for so many reasons. I mean, the same things that are, affecting everyone. Students who are incarcerated have family members who are dying and family members who are out of work because of COVID, instability in housing, food insecurity. Those kinds of things are all really having a huge traumatic impact on our clients. But then if you look to the education piece alone, I mean, it's just been a complete disaster. So for students in the community, obviously in March 2020, things were bad for everyone. The school sort of didn't know what to do. Everyone's trying to figure that out. But eventually things got figured out, right? Students got laptops and access to internet. Obviously there are still huge equity issues at play in the community, but the school system started to sort of get their bearings and figure out how to handle things. For students who are incarcerated, that just never happened. Like students just did not get education for the entire period of COVID. And unfortunately, is so often the case for students who are incarcerated, their voices often get silenced, right? And they're very often the last priority. And so everyone was so focused on community schools and what was happening in the community that, the students who were inside facilities, they just effectively got left behind for this entire period of time. So, we've worked, we partnered with a law firm and the Washington Lawyers Committee. So we partnered with them to file a class action lawsuit that basically addressed this challenge of students who are incarcerated in the DC jail not having access to education during COVID. And this case is still going on. I will say I won't get into all of the details of it, but so in June, there was an injunction. Judge Nichols recently, 2 weeks ago, ordered DC in contempt of his June 16th preliminary injunction, which was basically saying that they needed to provide special education to students at the jail. And so even though he said that, back in June, students still weren't receiving it, it by mid-February. And so the judge said, like, okay, DC, you're in contempt. Students are still not receiving their IDA mandated specialized instruction and services. So the district is going to have to basically remedy this. And so to remedy it, there are a couple things that the judge said that the district needed to do. And so we're hoping that this will at least like be some measure of progress on the case. But I will say that it's difficult that we have to be like this deep in litigation for students to be getting something that they've been entitled to this entire time. And as you know, there are time constraints with eligibility, and that students, they are trying to get their education and they just can't. And so all of this time that's going by is really, really wasted time for them. And it's really tragic, frankly.
And you don't get that time back, right?
Right.
So for the folks that are listening that are non-educators, what happens is the larger your gaps between instructional time too, the sequence of information in your brain, the connections that your brain makes to previously learned content, it weakens and it is harder to regain. It's much like I haven't ridden a bicycle in 15 years. And the last time I tried to ride one, I literally couldn't get back on. And so it takes a lot of time. It's going to take intensive support in order to remedy this gap of instruction that the students, your clients, are actually seeking. So this is an active lawsuit. It sounds like there's updates happening regularly.
Yes, it's actually moving quite quickly, which is, for litigation, which is great.
Well, and like we said, time is of the essence. Time matters, especially time boxed students with IEPs and 504s, that you run out of time once you turn, as you said, in DC, you said the age was 21 in your 20 or your 22nd term when you're turning 22. So for many of them, they're probably aging out after 2 years of lost instructional time.
That's right. And luckily, one of the things that the judge said recently was that he ordered extended eligibility for the necessary amount of time that the students would need to have received the education.
Okay, great.
Which is great, which is huge. But to what you were saying about that doesn't sort of change the sort of learning process, right? That everything should be relatively sequential, and it would have, But luckily, the IDA does provide sort of a structure to be getting compensatory education. And so it's not necessarily like an hour for hour thing, right? That it might take more education to actually like catch up on where you would to get you to where you would have been had you had the proper education in the first place. So so that's sort of where we are. And, I have to say it's been great. We're a small organization. School Justice Project has we just hired our 6th lawyer, which is exciting. But there are 6 of us. And so it's been amazing to work with Washington Lawyers Committee and Terrace, Pravlik, and Millian, the law firm I mentioned, because they have such extensive experience doing this kind of complex litigation. So for us, this has been really important for our clients and we hope really important for the city and potentially, could also provide precedent for other jurisdictions.
Yeah, absolutely. I imagine DC is not the only place that has I would imagine not the only place that has suspended, typical instruction for students that were incarcerated during the pandemic.
That's right. And, if we learn anything, if we've learned anything from our work, we see that, throughout the country, students who are incarcerated are not prioritized. And so, I think one of the largest learnings I've had having been in the classroom and then sort of in the courtroom is just the importance of prioritizing, the students who need things the most, right? And so students who are in foster care, students who are homeless, students who are in the juvenile and criminal legal systems, their educations have so often been disrupted that we need to, put so many resources and prioritize their education moving forward. And I think that's especially true after COVID.
I'm sort of at a loss of words, which is rare for me, Claire, but I'm a bit at a loss of words just at the gravity of the situation. And when you talk to your clients and I'm wondering, in your experience in your advocacy work and just moving the needle forward, what is the hope? What is the hope for your clients long-term? Again, you said, if I put myself out of a job, you gave one scenario in which you could put yourself out of a job. What is the goal? If at the end, what will you hope has happened for students everywhere that are incarcerated or in the system?
Yeah, students who are incarcerated should have the same shot the same chance as students who are in the community. And so, I think our goal is to make sure that their educational experience is high quality and is, the same as students who are in the community at excellent, high quality schools. Ideally, they won't need special education lawyers unless they need them the same way that, rich families from the suburbs need them, right? Like you might want one to come to a IEP meeting with you to help advocate, but you shouldn't need one to basically like undo the past 7 years of educational neglect, right? And so the role of an education lawyer for those students should change. And for us, like we hope that we're able to, until that happens, we hope to be able to grow capacity, not just like at SJP, but sort of citywide capacity and attention on the issue so that any student who's involved in the court system has access to a free special education lawyer.
Seems like a pretty good goal to me.
Thank you. I'll keep you posted on how it's going. One thing I will say on that, DC actually we've been working on some really cool legislation that would make available free special education lawyers in criminal court. So like in the same way where you could get a defense attorney appointed to you, you could get a special education attorney appointed to you. And DC already has that in the family court. Like so for juvenile cases or neglect cases, you already can get free special ed lawyers who are paid by the court. That creates sort of a market. So if you're a private special education lawyer, you could still make money representing people who can't pay you. So it's like obviously a great incentive. But the problem is, even though you still have special education rights after age 18, they don't, for some reason, this has never like translated to the adult criminal court. And so we've tried to close that gap. And so legislation was introduced last February on this. And we believe, hopefully it will pass. I think everyone seems to be in favor of it, but this would be the first panel of its kind in the country. And so what we're really hoping is that we can get this passed and then, train other jurisdictions on sort of the benefit of this legislation and the benefit of special education lawyers in criminal court. And so other jurisdictions could actually implement the same thing. So that's one of the sort of current systemic advocacy goals we have going on.
Also incredible. And I can see the impact it would have to have those types of supports in place automatically, not based on like the size of your bank account at the time when you engage. So exactly. That's incredible. Thank you. Claire, I'm wondering how your perspective has changed since your early days of being a tutor in schools to being a teacher in an all-boys charter school to where you are now. How has your perspective working across and with all types of students developed?
That's a great question. I think when I was younger, I had this sense that like, if there were, good schools, the world could be fixed. And, I don't think I sort of fully grasped the impact of, historical racism, current racism, and just sort of the what needs to be changed that's sort of outside, just the specific like world of education. But that obviously has had an impact on education from the very beginning. And then, our current education systems continue to perpetuate the problem, right? So everything is obviously intertwined and inextricably linked. But I think the way I saw things, it was just like a lot more sort of siloed. Then teaching, I saw how incredible, good schools and good classrooms could, the incredible difference that they could make. And how important, the classroom is. And I think, but I still saw at that time that even no matter like what was happening in schools or even like within the education policy world, that there were just still, again, so many other issues at play. And so again, that's sort of what brought me into the legal sector, because, if kids are getting kicked out of school and don't have much recourse, there is not a whole lot that teachers can do. And I think as a teacher, I really felt that like, that there's this element that's outside of your control, right? So now I would say, probably like the most important sort of learning or perspective shift has just been like how important being able to sort of view and attack things, sort of different systems and see the different layers, how important that is. And that it's critical to have, educators and policy people and agencies and lawyers all working to improve educational equity and to make sure that we can write the system, because, lawyers can't do it alone. Teachers can't do it alone. Like there's no sort of one sector that's going to be able to tackle the issues, because they're just so deep. And so we need to sort of work together, and we sometimes, we have to be working in opposition in order to get to the sort of unified goal, right? And so like lawyers can hold school systems accountable, and yet like still have the same goals. So I think, to me, I've spent a lot of time thinking about how important it is to have different stakeholders and have everyone sort of at the table.
Yeah, that's profound. I mean, at the end of the day, if what we're all working towards is equitable access to high quality education, it takes every angle to achieve that. You're right. It can't happen with just the teacher. I don't know if you're watching Abbott Elementary right now, but it is like this show about a teacher in Philadelphia who, she's young and she's bright-eyed and she's like, I can change and like through the course of the season, she's realizing like what her locus of control is, but also how much, and I just watched another episode last night, but like how much working within her school as like one example, microcosm of your bigger picture and bigger vision, how working with everybody is so necessary for students to grow holistically, not just one student, but all the students. And so I keep drawing parallels to the show because it really resonates with me, and it's apparently resonating with much of America, but I really understand your point quite well, which is it takes so many people's investment and collaboration. It's not one person's job.
Totally. And I think the other thing, which I don't think I understood at first, but I definitely learned while in the classroom, and now, working with clients, it's definitely the case. Just the importance of sort of centering the student, right? That, as a teacher, you don't know better than the student comes to the classroom with his own set of experiences and knowledge and goals and dreams, et cetera. And the teacher can help be sort of a guide and a steward to access things, but that the student is really the one who needs to be centered. And so being able to make sure that like we're building systems where we're focusing on what students are saying they need, not like necessarily what we think they need. And same thing with clients, we do express interest representation. There are times where I might disagree with a client that like the route that they're taking is the one that, is the best. But, I can do some counseling, but ultimately a young person knows themselves and is able and perfectly capable, better able to make decisions for their own lives. And so being able to make sure that you're sort of centering the young person instead of putting your own opinions or biases or perspectives in front of theirs.
I was going to ask you as a final question, as I often do, what advice you would give an educator at the start of their career, but I think you just gave it.
Yeah, I would say that's
the advice. I mean, I'll give you an opportunity to add to it, but like that sounds like really the advice that you would give.
Yeah, no, I mean that's I think my clear answer. And I will say that like having, in both the classroom and the courtroom, that has served to be the most important learning, and that the relationships that I built with students, the relationships I built with clients, that was everything, right? And so, anyone who's starting out on their, educator journey, just being able to really form those relationships and really get to know your students, I mean, that can be, I mean, that's the one. That's the thing to do.
Work. That is absolutely the work. Wow, Claire, it has been an absolute honor to listen to the drive, the passion, and the vision that you and your team are collaborating on to support students throughout Washington, D.C., and it sounds like the country. Your view is really inspiring, and I feel so grateful you shared what is really important time that you could be spending doing other things with us today to talk about School Justice Project and your journey.
Well, thank you so much for having me here. It's been really great to talk with you. And also, if anyone listening has any questions on the litigation, my colleague Teo Bell is running the litigation for our team, and she's incredible and would be happy to talk with anyone about that as well.
Great. Well, thank you again so much for coming, and thanks to everybody who joined us today and is listening.
Thank you so much, and good to see you.
Good to see you too.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to the Learning Can't Wait podcast. If you liked what you heard, please rate, review, and share this episode. Be the first to know when we have a new episode by subscribing wherever you listen to podcasts. If you'd like to be a guest on the show or have a suggestion for an episode, email us at podcast@itutor.com.